Okay, let's take a look at how this works when we're actually doing it inside our code. So I have the example here. I was talking about how we have to calculate different tax rates for different provinces inside Canada. So I'm basically going to ask the user what province they live in, and I would actually do this on an online website. I would actually be looking at the province they selected when they make a purchase online, and then I'm assuming initially that the tax is 0, and then I'm saying, well, based on the province you enter, let's go ahead and assign an appropriate tax rate, and I'll just print that tax rate out at the end so we can see I'm using this for debugging purposes to make sure that I'm calculating the correct tax rate. So when I run this code, multiple call Python, multiple if statements dot py. So I run that code. It says, what province do you live in? Well, I happen to live in Ontario, so I'm going to type in Ontario. And it comes back and says, oh, 13%. And if I go check my code, yes, that is correct. It recognized that the province was Ontario, and it should be 13%. Now, this is just using a separate if statement for each. In this case, because it would never be equal to multiple of these at the same time, it would be a little more elegant if I change this to an elif. So just changing that if to elif. And it's simply a way of saying, if it's not Alberta, then check if it's none of it. If it's not none of it, then check if it's Ontario. So rather than having separate if statements, I'm now treating them as one if statement with different conditions. When I execute it, it's basically the same thing. What province do I live in? Let's type in none of it this time, just for something different. Help if I could type it correctly. And it comes back and returns 5%. If we take a look, sure enough, none of it should have returned a tax rate of 5%. So again, these print statements are helping me make sure my code is executing correctly. So everything looks good so far. But what if I want to say I'm in none of the above? What if I'm in the province of Quebec, which is an entirely different province? So I go here and I run it, and I specify Quebec, and it comes back and says if a tax rate is 0. And I go, wait a second, that's not right. So what I realize is I need to say if they're in any of the other provinces. So let's add an else statement, and let's say every other province, let's assume the tax is 15%. Now, it's not quite accurate, but close enough for the sake of experimenting in the demo. So now I run my code. I'm going to clear the screen here so you can see a little bit better. And now when I run it, now if I enter Quebec, it'll come back and set 15%. So you can see how now we've got multiple conditions we're checking. We've got the else statement and elif, so it's getting a little more elegant in our code. But there's still more improvements to be made. What I could do is I say, wait a second, none of it in Alberta are giving me exactly the same tax rate. So maybe I can combine those into one condition. And I can do that using an or statement. Because I can say if province equals Alberta, or province is none of it. So I can literally take this statement here. So if it's one or the other, don't forget your colon at the end. There we go. Then the tax rate is 0.05. So same logic again, just a different way of expressing it. So now when I go ahead and I run, and if I specify Ontario, we'll just test that. Successfully returns 13%. Let's test it with Alberta. Yep, 5%. Let's test it with none of it. Correct value, 5%. And let's test it with Quebec. And correctly returns 15%. By the way, Christopher was talking a bit about unit testing and that module of exceptions. Really take that to heart. When you deal with if statements, you have to be very careful to make sure that all the possible outputs are tested, because you might find that 3 out of the 4 work, but the 4th one doesn't work. And that's the kind of stuff that gets buggy code out into production. So always test every possible condition. Now, in this situation, I have 2 different provinces that return the same output, but both of them are actually checking the same value. They're still looking in the province variable for a value. So one of the things you can do is replace that or statement with an in. And that allows you to say, if the value of province is one of the values in this list, then set the tax to 5%. And it turns out you can even add 4, 5, 6, 7 values to this. So you can pass in just 2 values, but I realize the Yukon has the same tax rate, so I can actually add Yukon to that as well. So now, if I run my code and I pass in Yukon, it should return 5%. If I pass in Alberta, 5%. Let's test none of it, because I haven't tried that one yet. Would help if I ran the code first. I'm getting ahead of myself. And then 5%, and then I test Ontario to to make sure that hasn't broken. And then I test Nova Scotia, just something that's not any of the above, 15%. So again, still working, but now I'm using an in statement to do it. So I've basically just written the same code 4 different ways. This is my favorite one. I find it's the cleanest, but again, all of them are going to work. Just make sure you test for every possible condition to make sure it works. That leaves one more scenario. I have somebody from out of country ordering something on my website. If you're not from Canada, we don't charge you the Canadian taxes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a nested if statement. I'm going to ask what country you live in. And if you're not in Canada, then we aren't going to charge you that tax. So you'll see I have an if statement here. If country is Canada, then do all that complicated logic to figure out what the provincial taxes are. So then ask them what province they are and get all that information. Otherwise, set the tax to 0, because if you're from outside Canada, you shouldn't be paying those taxes. And in fact, I just realized I shouldn't even ask you what province you live in unless you're from Canada. So I might even just move that statement there. So if you're from Canada, then I'm going to ask you what province you live in and then evaluate how much I should charge you as tax. But let's not even ask you for the province if you're not from here. Not every country is broken into provinces. So now when I run this code, oops, need to say Python nested if .py. Would help if I could type .py, Susan, that would make a difference. What country do I live in? I enter Canada. What province, state do I live in? Ah, here we go. Because I specified the country was Canada, when the if statement ran, it said, oh, you're in Canada. I have to ask you what province or state you live in. So I go, okay, I live in Ontario. And then it comes back and says the tax rate is 13%, and that's correct. So then I need to test what happens if I say I live in United Kingdom. And it comes back and returns 0. I'm like, hey, it's working. This is great. So then I test it again, and I say I live in Canada, and it comes back and forgets to prompt me for the province. I'm like, wait a second. I was about to try and test Yukon and Alberta, but got an error. Okay, runtime errors, debugging time, and then wait. Think back to the last module. When I'm comparing strings, I have to make sure that those comparisons are case insensitive. So there we go. That's when I realized I made a little mistake in my code, and I should make my code a little more robust by checking, converting what you passed me in lowercase and comparing that to a lowercase string. Should probably do the same thing for provinces as well. So let's just see if that fixes my problem. Now I enter Canada, even no matter how I enter Canada now. Yes, there we go. It now successfully recognizes that, and I can now enter a province and get the right tax rate. So there we have it. Working with conditions, we've got nested if statements. I've got a couple more if tricks to show you coming up next, but you can see you have to be very careful with the testing as you start playing with those if statements.